This is Anna Swank, and this is my audience at the beginning of my speech presentation. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Caspar David Friedrich's life and his painting, The Monk by the Sea. To start off, my goal today is to get you guys, whenever I say Caspar David Friedrich, instead of saying, "Who's that?" you say, "I've heard of that guy." And we're going to do an activity, which is what the papers are for, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then we're going to go over his childhood, middle age, and the end of his life, where he went to school, his family life, and the painting, The Monk by the Sea. Okay, so for the activity, you're going to each write down 3 facts on the piece of paper that I gave you. And then at the end of the presentation, each person will go around and share one of their 3 interesting facts. Okay, so Caspar David Friedrich, his early childhood. He was born on September 5th, 1774, and I'm going to butcher this, Greifswald, Swedish Pomeranian, on the Baltic coast of Germany. And this is where a lot of his inspirations for a lot of his paintings came from. He was the 6th of 10 children, but his childhood was pretty tragic because when he was 6, his sister died, and then right after that, a year later, his mother died when he was 7. And then fast forward a couple years, and him and his brother were out playing on the ice, and his brother tried to save him from drowning because he fell into the ice, but in return, he ended up drowning himself. So a lot of people think that these incidents started his themes in a bunch of his early paintings, because a bunch of his early paintings were dark. And that's a picture of the guy. It's kind of scary looking. Okay, so in 1790, Caspar Friedrich went to the University of Greifswald, and that's that university. He was taught by Johann Gottfried Quistorp, and she introduced him to Kossegarten, and he believed that nature to be a revelation of God. And so that stuck with Friedrich in all of his paintings, because German Romanticism, which is what his paintings were based on, they were all nature-centered instead of God and religion-centered, like the majority of artists before him. And his teacher also introduced him to Adam Alzheimer, who his religious subjects in his paintings were overwhelmed by naturistic scenes. So that also stuck with Friedrich. And in 1794, Friedrich got into the Academy of Copenhagen. No, it's Copenhagen.
No.
I googled it. Okay, and from that school he learned how to copy casts of sculptures, and he drew more scenes about life. And that's where he began embracing the romantic visual. Middle-aged Friedrich, during his late 20s, he moved permanently to Dresden, and there he experimented with printmaking, etchings, and wood cuttings, but he ended up doing most of his work in ink, watercolor, and sepias. He made trips to the Baltic coast, which is, like I said earlier, and the mountains proved an endless source of inspiration for his landscapes. So that's where he got all his ideas for his landscapes. He was very fond of woods, harbors, hills, and atmospheric mists. Friedrich was the first to sketch everything in pencil while looking at it, and then later on he would go back to paint over it by memory. His first oil painting was the landscape with temple ruins, and that was kind of his first with people in it. Later on in life, he got married to Caroline Bommer on January 21st, 1818, and they had 3 children, the first being in 1820. A lot of people believe that after he got married, people began coming into his paintings more, and that his palettes were brighter. And a good example of this is Chalk Cliffs on Rügen, which he painted after his honeymoon. And you can see that it's more romantic and there's men and women in it. Later on, he found out that to be successful, a lot of it is about who you know and who you get to see your work. So he had a lot of support from Russia. The Grand Duke Nikolai Pavlovich visited his studio and left with many paintings of his for his own home in 1820. And then in 1821, a poet, Vasily Zahovsky, purchased Friedrich's work for himself and made recommendations to royal families. His later life, his reputation declined as Romanticism went downhill and became less popular. He became viewed as odd and depressed. And by 1820, he was described as the most solitary of the solitary. The downhill slide, in 1835, he had his first stroke, and he was partially paralyzed, so he wasn't able to work in as many forms of painting as he was before, so he could only work with watercolor and sepia. And the darkest of all his shorelines is Seashore by Moonlight, and he actually painted this painting after his first stroke in 1835, and using his hand that he was not dominant in. And then he also painted in 1803 The Monk by the Sea, and that's pretty much what one of my favorite paintings of his is, because it's got the sand and the ocean, and then the sky blends in and gets lighter instead of going from dark to light. A few quick facts about Monk by the Sea. It was painted between 1808 and 1810 in Dresden, and it was shown for the first time in 1810 at the Berlin Academy exhibition of 1810, and it was his most radical composition because he wasn't focused on the illusion of depth. And so right now we're going to watch a short video from Cannes Academy that discusses this painting.
In so much 19th century painting, figures enact a narrative, a kind of story before us, and we watch them as if we're an audience looking into this space. But with the work of Caspar David Friedrich, so often he gives us a small lone figure, and instead of looking towards that figure, we in a sense become that figure, and we begin to see what the figure sees.
And that's exactly what we have here in The Monk by the Sea, which is in so many ways a really radically modern, pared down image.
We have this vast sky, and it takes up the preponderance of the canvas. It looks cold, and it's clear at the top, these wisps of the clouds, but then it becomes much darker and much more menacing. The ocean below looks freezing cold. It's almost black. We can just make out large swirls of the waves, and then below that, the cold winter dunes, presumably near Greifswald in northern Germany. This is the Baltic coast, and we see that monk below the sea's horizon line.
And because the figure that we're looking at is a monk, we associate that figure with questions of the spiritual. And so we immediately turn our thoughts in that direction.
He is caught in those narrow bands of the earthly. He is below the horizon line, but he is aware, and we then become aware of the vastness of the spiritual realm, of the sky above, but also the threatening nature of the world in which we inhabit. Those whitecaps are just picking up the tops of what are really substantial waves, and we can feel the power of nature, the power of that ocean. And I think that notion of the sublime was a very important idea at the end of the 18th and in the 19th century. This is an ancient idea that was revived probably most famously by Edmund Burke in England. The idea was that there is a kind of beauty that is actually awe-inspiring through its power and its terror, and that was a way of directly confronting God's presence in our world.
It's both the vastness of nature and the smallness of man and the powerlessness of man. And this figure seems to look toward the right. We know originally that Friedrich had painted a ship on the horizon, which certainly would have made this scene much more mundane.
You know, the 19th century is the time most associated with man's control over nature, and this is a kind of antidote to that. This is saying, no, in fact, nature is far greater than us. Our technological advances are allowing us to feel as if we have conquered nature. Here is a humble reminder that the opposite is really true.
It's right around this time that Mary Shelley is writing Frankenstein, where man has the ultimate power of creating life like God. And Dr. Frankenstein is punished for the pride that makes him think he can rival God. And so I think it's really true that at this moment, at the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, we have a sense of our own power, and at the same time, we question that power.
You know, in the 19th century, I think one of the key questions is how can the grandeur and power of God, of spirituality, be represented in our more scientific, more industrialized culture? So the monk by the sea